This session tonight is going to look at grassroots club governance. It's the first time we've run a session like this, going into this kind of detail around club legal structures and what contributes and helps with effective club governance at a grassroots level. So I do hope you will find it useful. The content itself is pretty much aimed at grassroots clubs who are not registered charities or registered businesses with Companies House. So it's really for what we call unincorporated associations, collective groups of members, but without any formal legal registration with any government agency. I will come on to that in a lot more detail, but I just want to make sure we set the scene before we start as to where this is kind of pitched. So over the course of the session, we are going to look at the basics of unincorporated association, good governance and management committees. And if you don't understand some of these terms for now, don't worry, I will come on to them in much more detail and try and explain them. But we'll look at governance, management committees, and what both we as the county FA and the FA expect of member clubs. Give some advice around appropriate management structures and options for long-term sustainability. We then will also look at future growth and alternative legal structures that may be out there if you are outgrowing, should we say, that basic unincorporated association model. So we'll look a little bit around incorporation and charitable status. What I won't be going into this evening, though, is financial strategy or structures. That's primarily because we will be running a separate webinar in about a month's time that will kind of look at that aspect. So this is much more around the governance and the institution itself. I also need to caveat that I am not able to provide advice or recommend any specific model that you as a club should go down. This is because that technically constitute legal advice, and that's something I'm not qualified for. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't overstep my bounds in that sense. So if you do get to the stage where you are considering changing your legal structure, we always do recommend you do look at getting the appropriate legal advice from qualified practitioners that can give you more effective advice and something that has a bit of more legal underpinning and security in it than we do here at the County FA. Although obviously we do have a lot of experience in this, we're not qualified experts to that level. So I'm going to come on to unincorporated associations first of all. Now, don't worry if this is a new term you've never heard before. I'll try and break it down as much as possible, and this is probably 95% of our clubs here at Berks and Bucks will fall within this categorization of unincorporated associations. So at their heart, an unincorporated association is defined as an association of like-minded individuals who have come together with a common purpose. So in effect, a club. This is, as I said before, effectively the default structure that we have in grassroots football. And if you're not sure what your structure is, and it's not written down anywhere, you're not registered with any kind of government agencies, a Companies House, Charities Commission, or anything like that, you will most likely be an unincorporated association. So for example, if you're just a group of friends who have set up a team for your Sunday league, if it's a group of parents that have come together to run teams for their children, and that's kind of grown and grown and grown, but you have never got to the point of registering yourselves, then you would be considered an unincorporated association. Looking through Berks and Bucks, I make it about 97% of our clubs are listed through the whole game system as unincorporated associations. So, as I say, it's the vast, vast majority of what we work with at grassroots football. So, unincorporated associations are independent bodies. It is their own association, the own group, and own club. So it is run for and by the members with very little outside interference. Certainly, in terms of legal regulations, there's no requirement around financial reporting or listing of articles and constitutions, registration with the government, and so forth. You still have to affiliate to us as a county football association, but for the most part, we will let you manage yourselves. It is not our place to intervene and dictate how the inner workings of that club is run and how you operate. Flip side of that, of course, is that if things do go wrong, we're also not able to intervene for positive reasons and to try and bail you out in those kinds of situations. So as such, we define clubs as self-governing. You set your own structure, you set your own rules. What I would say is you should always make sure you do still have these in place. You do still need an underpinning constitution that just sets down very basically who does what, why, when, and how. The reason for that, and this is where it's crucial, and this is what I will spend a little bit of time talking about later, is that the members of an unincorporated association, so the club members, are what's called jointly and severally liable for club actions and financial obligations under this structure. I'll come on to what that means, but this is why it's important that you are aware of what your structure is, because obviously this brings with it a degree of personal risk and liability. So the more you are aware of what your structure is and what it means, the more secure you will be in your own actions. So although it is the basic model, should we say, and the default model within grassroots football, there are still some minimum expectations from the FA and from the county as to what we expect you to still be doing. The first is that every club should have a constitution. As I said before, this is your own governing principles about who does what, when, why, and how. So it's setting how the club is run, by whom, and technically is a requirement under FA regulations. Now, as the county FA at the moment, we don't insist on seeing a copy of a club constitution. It's there as an expectation that something that's happening in the background. But probably given the increased concern we've seen around legislation and risk in grassroots football, we're in a slightly more litigious society in general. There's obviously a much greater emphasis and focus on safeguarding, on insurance, even at a basic club level. It is something we are looking to probably enforce or begin to request on a much more regular basis. That is something will probably come in for the 22-23 season, though. Certainly, this webinar is part of that process to help clubs understand your responsibilities and understand those obligations. Next up, a constitution will also be required to set up your club bank account. And again, this is a requirement under FA regulations. It's not something where we track too much or worry too much if we do get a payment that comes in from an individual, but certainly a club bank account may be a requirement for other contracts or other contracts that as a club you enter into. The other reason it's important to have a club bank account is it reduces the risk on you as volunteers, because it ensures that the financial transactions are being done by the club as an association, not by you as an individual. The third expectation is for there to be a list of members. Again, this is important because of that joint and several liability, but equally you'll see that it's a requirement within standard code of rules from your league that you have a list of members that you can provide to them at any time. Something that we ask because of our things like debt recovery action and so forth. And I'll come on to different types of membership models and who might be defined as a member in a short while. Those club members then need to be able to hold the club officers to account at an AGM, where they get to vote on key decisions such as the election of officers, approve the finances, check and challenge, and conduct other business that you may feel should go to members, things like growth and expansion into different formats. It comes back to that principle before. Think of it like the US Constitution: for the people, by the people. Clubs are run by the members for the members. Finally, and hopefully this goes without saying, but clubs still have to comply with football regulations, and that's probably where we do come in around things like safeguarding, crucially, club affiliation, and all of those kind of annual business really that we do as the county FA. Now, as part of the message that popped up in the chat from Natalie, and it's what do we do if you don't have a written constitution? The best place to start will be the FA's standard club rules, which are available as a template on the FA website, or we can provide a copy as well if you like. It's very quick and easy. It's effectively a blank template, so you can just put the club name in at the various points. get the members to agree to it, and it just sets those basic requirements out around how the club conducts its business. What I would say though is obviously the requirements within that do still need to be met, particularly around things like the annual general meeting and so forth. But I'm more than happy to send those copy of those standard club rules over as a template after the meeting if you like as well. So the legal implications then of being an unincorporated association. The first thing to be said, and this is where it gets slightly more technical and jargonistic, unincorporated associations have no separate legal identity, so cannot enter into agreements as an organisation. They're not classified within that definition of a legal person, which an incorporated or registered business is. So what this means is that any agreements and contracts cannot be entered into under the club's name because it doesn't exist as a registered entity. So any contracts will typically be in the name of a club officer or an individual acting on behalf of the club. That individual is entering into a contract on their own behalf as well as on behalf of the club. So effectively, if they default on that agreement, if there's any legal complications arising out of that, that individual becomes personally liable for it because they have entered into that contract by themselves. Equally, the club as an institution cannot be sued in terms of legal action. Again, it would be against the officers or the named members of the club. And finally, the club as an institution and as an organisation cannot hold any long-term assets such as land or financial investments. Again, they will be in the name of the officer signing them. So this is crucial, particularly if you have a change in club ownership, or not, sorry, completely the wrong term. If you have a change in club officers and management, you need to check that there are no long-term contracts which are in those individuals' names, or heaven forbid, if you have a senior club officer passes away, it's important to know the status of those contracts and make sure they're transferred to another individual that is active within the club at that time. So joint and several liability, I've mentioned it a couple of times, and I mentioned around those legal implications. And this is where the risk comes in for club officers and club members. As unincorporated associations are not separate legal entities, its members are jointly and severally liable for any legal obligations or financial debts. So the membership as a whole is jointly responsible for the actions of the club. So they are jointly responsible for ensuring that any debts are paid. I'm going to use debts just because it's the easiest way to get your head around it and the easiest example to use here. So as a club, every single member is responsible for the club's debts. However, each individual is also severally liable. And what that means is that as an individual, you have an individual responsibility to make sure that the collective debt is also paid. Effectively, what it means is that if the club were to default on a payment on any contract it has, then the creditor, the person that you owe the money to, would be able to come to any individual member or officer of the club for the entire amount that is owed to them. It works on the basis that the first priority is to repay the creditor, that they get their money back. And then it's for the club members to work out how to split the costs, or for the officer that's repaid the creditor in full to then look to seek shares of that debt from amongst its members. What I'm not trying to do here is scare anyone. And I appreciate what I'm saying is could be putting a lot of people off getting involved in grassroots football generally. And as I said, that's really not the intention. I'm looking to make sure people are aware of the impact of this unincorporated association. And we'll come on to how you then mitigate against these risks shortly. And it is around making sure that you do follow things like the club constitution and have annual meetings and do follow up and have good financial measures in place to avoid things like contracts or long-term critical financial decisions being taken without the knowledge or consent of the members. And the other thing I would say is, yes, whilst I have heard stories of where this has gone wrong within grassroots football, we are talking one or two cases over the space of the 5 years that I've been in this post. So it is, and that's at a national level, not just within Berks and Bucks. So yes, it can go wrong, and if it goes wrong, it can go very wrong. But it is rare that it happens like this. So it's not something that you should be facing on a yearly basis. It is just important that, particularly if you're getting into a position where you are joining a club management committee, you're aware of that legal structure and what the implication could be on you individually. The last thing I want is for a single volunteer to suddenly find themselves footing the bill because of poor club governance and having a significant impact on them as an individual. So I'm going to come on now as to the good governance side of things, and as I said, how you as a club can make sure that you're mitigating any of these risks to protect your volunteers and to protect the club as an institution. So trying to define good governance first of all, if at its broadest level, it just means ensuring that decisions are taken in a fair and appropriate manner. So we want to make sure things are done correctly and done appropriately for the level of the business or the organization that we're talking about here. So I'm just popping up a couple of terms on the screen at the moment to try and get your mind thinking about some of those key principles that would fall within this. So good governance means that decisions are transparent and that people are acting in an accountable manner, that decisions are inclusive and fair, that they're responding to the circumstances and responding to any concerns or questions that come in. That decisions are participatory and consensus building, so it's not one or two individuals going against the grain or going against the wishes of everybody else. You're looking to involve as many people as possible and come to that consensus agreement. And finally, that they're legal. The decisions are legal. And I put that in quotation marks because we're not talking talk, we're not talking the Old Bailey, we're not talking high court judges. I just mean legal in terms of proper and in accordance with a club's constitution. And that is equally not to say that if you don't follow club constitution, it's deemed illegal. So the basis underneath good club governance is this model here, which effectively applies across all functions of the club, and the same would apply across leagues as well, that the membership appoint the committee who then make decisions on their behalf and then report back to the members. At that point, the members then have the opportunity to re-elect that committee or vote in another committee if they don't agree with the decisions they've taken. So it's a constant circle on an annual basis around representative democracy, for want of a better term. It is very much like voting in your member of parliament. Every 4 or 5 years, you get the option to vote them out again if you don't agree with the actions that they've taken and how they've represented you. This is also the model that kind of applies within the management committee, I would say, that you may have subcommittees dealing with finances, dealing with development strategies or plans, and dealing with coaches and so forth. And again, decisions may get delegated down to a subcommittee, but that subcommittee should then be reporting back to the management committee to ratify those decisions and to check and challenge. This is very much also how we work as a county FA, that our board of directors, there are representatives that come out of our governing council made up of league representatives. And again, they're re-elected on every 3 years, or I believe it is. So you have that opportunity to check and challenge those people that are making decisions on your behalf. Part of this relies on the annual general meeting, and this is a crucial function that should be, or that should and must be held across every single club. It's a basic opportunity, and it has level of formality that you deem appropriate, but there should be an opportunity for the management committee to report to its members on the actions they've taken over the previous year, provide an update on the financial reports and any contracts they've entered into, how they've spent the money, so that as the members, if I'm paying my £150 a year membership fee to the club and my £30 weekly subs, or whatever it may be, that the management committee is going to report back as to where that money's gone and how it's been spent. Also then have the opportunity based off that to elect a committee, and that's appoint or reappoint new members, and then approve any changes to the constitution and that governing document that determines how the club is run. As I say, there's degrees of formality how you want to do management committee, oh sorry, how you want to do an AGM. It doesn't have to be hire a town hall and have it set up with a board of directors type table at the front and um, let members pepper them with questions. Can be slightly more casual. It can be meeting up at somebody's house or down the pub, um, and a 10-minute general meeting followed by an hour of catching up as friends. But it's still an important function that be should still be recorded and forms part of um, that membership process that shows that those members are still consenting and agreeing with the decisions taken by the management committee. And if we look at what a management committee provides, relating it back to some of those key concepts of good governance I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the annual general meeting provides accountability, transparency, participation, a consensus agreement, and it offers that legality to the decisions that have been taken by the management committee and the election of individuals to run the club. Other considerations then around what constitutes good governance within a club, and this will very much be based on your own personal needs within the club and size and structure. We can't give a one size fits all because we're working with everything from single team adult clubs to 60 team adult and youth clubs. So depending on the size and the scope and what different functions and formats the club plays in, you may want different kinds of structures. But these are certain things you can try and consider around how it will help for you. First is around committee size and potentially then the use of subcommittees. Um, you may not need subcommittees, and certainly smaller clubs, I would suggest probably don't need small subcommittees. But if you are a larger club, you may want to consider how you structure subcommittees, what powers delegated to them, and then how they're held accountable. So, how are the members of the subcommittees appointed? Who do they report back to? And then where does it fit within that wider club governance cycle that I presented earlier on? You'll also want to think about who is represented on the committee and what different roles and specialities are there. Certainly, generally, there will always be a chair, a treasurer, a secretary, and a welfare officer if you're a youth club. But beyond that, again, if you are a very large club, you may want to have age group representatives, or if you do have male and female pathways, you may decide to have a women's football representative and a men's football representative. Again, there's no one size fits all. We can't tell you what the appropriate model is, but it's something you want to give consideration to make sure that that decision making is inclusive of all people participating within the club. You should then look at diversity of the committee, and this obviously includes things like the demographic background of the individuals, but this is also an interesting one around making sure there's diversity of households. And it's not to cast aspersions, it's not to criticize, it's not to say it's good or bad, but certainly if you have one couple fulfilling all roles within a management committee, there may not be diversity of thought, and it becomes very difficult to manage conflicts of interest if there is then an issue with somebody within the club management committee because it's a spouse or it's a family member that may be kind of managing that process. So it's important to make sure there is diversity of households, diversity of backgrounds in your committee. You should also consider whether the committee reflects the makeup of your player demographics, and potentially whether there is a youth voice within your management committee to make sure that actually the thoughts, the opinions, the experience of young players is represented through some kind of youth representation. You should also have a formal policy in place which is then adhered to around conflicts of interest. And this is real or perceived. And again, it's never meant as casting aspersions or saying we don't trust someone to give a fair and objective opinion. But sometimes it's about managing that outside perception, gives additional legitimacy to the decisions that are being made. So decisions that could be perceived to have a conflict of interest would be if there's decisions on partnerships or suppliers within the club where someone has a financial involvement with that organisation. Effectively, they're using the club to help support their financial health through the business. Could be where there's internal complaints or disciplinary action where there's a family relationship or long-standing personal relationship between two individuals within a club. Um, and as I said, again, just to reinforce, it's not a case that we're questioning someone's integrity here, but it's also about protecting the individual that may be making those decisions to ensure that they're not second guessed or criticised internally. Finally, and this is a slightly new one we're looking at, is around whether you might want to consider term limits for officers. I fully appreciate it's hard enough to get people to volunteer in the first place, and once they're there, you really want to hold on to them. But by looking to have term limits or at least some kind of progression plan up to the position of chair, let's say, it can help provide diversity of thought. And there is an argument to say that by having term limits, you can actually help promote volunteering because people will see a pathway. If the same individuals have been managing the club for 30 years, you may actually struggle to get new volunteers want to put their hand up because they never think they'll ever have an opportunity to have a voice in the decision making process. Whereas if there is a term limit, they may see that they will have an opportunity in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, whatever it may be. Any decision around that has to be carefully considered because, as I said before, it can be hard enough to get volunteers in the first place. But it is there as a consideration. Probably, I would say, particularly for the larger clubs or those that are looking at becoming incorporated or looking to get significant funding from outside bodies. Certainly, all of these considerations on the screen now are part of the Sport England Code of Governance. So if you are one of our larger clubs, you may want to look to adopt some of these principles to access some of the higher grant funds and so forth from Sport England. Finally, I'm going to come on to what constitutes a club member, as mentioned earlier on. And it's important to define this because it gives kind of covers things like voting rights and definitions within the club constitution. Oh, blimey, that is white. Sorry, that's not white. That is very dark. So apologise for that. If you can't see it, what this says is who. So ask the question of who is a club member, and it can include players, coaches, paying members, or voting members. So you can split it down as different tiers almost of club membership. Again, you might say that if you are a large community club with tens of teams, is it right that every player is automatically deemed to be a voting member of the club and able to influence in things like elections for officers or for some of the decisions taken at the AGM? Equally, you may say, is it right that someone can be a social member and still have an influence if they're not an active player? So again, it's not a case of being able to dictate to you what is the right model, but these are considerations you should think about when kind of defining members within the constitution. The other thing to remember is that the management committee does have the right to expel a member if they deem it in the best interest of the club. So within a constitution, there should be reference to a code of conduct and the ability of the management committee to expel a member if somebody breaches that. This decision itself should then be appealable to an appeal body within the club. And again, depending on the size of the club, depending on the size of the management committee, that could be a separate panel within the management committee where you have one body making the decision and then an appeal body made of other members. Or if it's a smaller club, you can go down the route of management committee make the first decision. If that's appealed, it goes to the wider club membership to determine that so that they have the ability to say if they want this individual to remain a part of the club or not. Again, this is a process that it highlights why it's important to manage that conflict of interest process and that there is fairness and transparency through everything. Finally, to relate it back to what I discussed at the very beginning, clubs are independent organisations, and we as a county FA are not in a position where we can or should look to dictate who is a member of a club or overturn a club decision. We're not qualified to be able to say whether that individual, whether it is in the best interest or not for an individual to remain a member of a club. We have our own processes when they breach FA regulations, so we will deal with that. If it is, if somebody assaults a match official, we have the ability to take them out of the game for as a player or as an official for a defined period of time. But effectively, anything leading up to that, if it's an internal dispute, it's up to the management committee to decide. As I said, though, there should be the opportunity for that decision to be appealed internally, as it cannot come to us as a county. We have run sessions in the past around managing internal complaints and are looking to do it again over the course of the coming season. And that will really help kind of look at what that process looks like. Equally, if you ever are in a position where there's a dispute over membership or a club member has acted in a way that you don't feel is proper and you do want support in what the correct process is, then by all means let us know and we'll help guide you through that and make sure it fits with your club constitution and the basic principles of good governance and good investigation. Before I move on to discussing a couple of other legal structures that are available, are there any questions just before I move on? Gives me a chance to have a sip of tea as well. Okay, I can't see any questions or hands up, so I'll push on. But by all means, if anything pops into your head, drop it in the chat and I'll come back to it in a short while. So I'm going to look at some of the other legal structures available out there. It's a very brief overview of 4 of the main alternative structures that should be considered by a club depending on your size. I won't go into it in as much detail, obviously, as I've gone into for unincorporated associations. So the first is a company limited by guarantee. So whereas an unincorporated association is not a legal entity within its own right, a company limited by guarantee is. So it's a recognised independent legal body, which is defined as being owned by its members with a limited individual liability. So there's a couple of different changes of terminology from what we've used before. Your constitution becomes articles of association, and these get registered and incorporated at Companies House. And the management committee will become a board of directors. So it's still elected in the same way. They're still unpaid at this level, but it's no longer a management committee, it is a board. This level does come with slightly more legal responsibilities. As I said before, you've got to lodge your articles of associations with Companies House, make sure any time there are changes to the board of directors that you update Companies House with the latest information. And it's important to note that those individual directors also have additional legal responsibilities and liabilities under UK law. They must effectively abide by directors' regulations. The club is now a recognised legal body, so it assumes the legal responsibility for any actions. And the individual member liability is limited to a nominal amount. So this could be £1 or £10 or so forth. That would still be claimed if the club defaulted on loans or there was legal action, but no one individual is suddenly going to have to stump up the full cost under that jointly and severally liable status. The club is also able to hold assets in the organisation's name, so it can own land and it can have investments. And also by being limited by guarantee, you may open the door to additional funding. What I would say, though, is that although it is a company and it is limited by guarantee and it's referred to as being owned by the members, they're not shareholders. So there is no claim or right to any dividends or any profits or assets if the club is wound up. It's what's known as an asset lock. Effectively, those assets have to remain with the club or be transferred to another organisation. They can't be divested amongst the members. Because of that, it is the most common type of incorporation for not-for-profit organisations. So if you are looking to move away from unincorporated association, but become incorporated and a legal body, this would be probably the most logical step to go to. The alternative structure then is the company limited by shares. So again, it's an independent legal body but it's owned by shareholders rather than members, who then assume that limited liability. Again, your constitution becomes your articles, your board of directors, your management committee become your board of directors, and they can now be remunerated. So they can be paid. It can be a paid board. Sorry, I can't get my words out. Um, the difference in the ownership is that there's a limited number of shares issued. So you only have your 1/100th, let's say, of the ownership of the organization, and that number stays fixed. So whereas limited by guarantee, it's shared equally by X number of members. Limited by shares, that same proportion applies. You can buy multiple shares, so you can own 2/100ths, 3/100ths, 4/100ths, and so forth. But it is a finite limit to the ownership. Also means that those shares can be transferred from one individual to another, and if there are profits, then the company can decide to issue dividends to those shareholders. This is rare to see in grassroots football, certainly, but as I'm sure you may imagine, is kind of the preferred model, shall we say, for professional clubs. Moving away from the business side and towards the charity side, there is what's known as a CASC, or a community amateur sports club, and this can actually be this can incorporate's the wrong word to use. This can include both unincorporated associations or companies limited by guarantee who can apply to be registered as a community amateur sports club. In this case, you have to be able to demonstrate that your main purpose, or the main purpose of the club, is the promotion of amateur sports. So part of that is you demonstrate an amateur ethos. Cannot be any payments towards players or officers, and you must be able to demonstrate that the purpose of the club is the provision of facilities for and the promotion of participation in one or more sports. What that means is it's an open membership policy, and your sole focus, effectively, or the main focus, has to be providing community sports. It's not around profit making. It's not around limiting membership or limiting your activities to one specific strand of football. It's around trying to make yourselves a community club for all members of the local community. The members must actively participate in sports, so you can't have social members, so effectively non-playing members. And the management committee must meet a fit and proper persons test. So again, it's wanting to make sure that the right kind of people are running these organisations. The assets, if you have any, must then also stay within sport if the club is wound up. What I would say with this, from everything that I've read, is that there's quite a very large degree of regulation restrictions around CASCs, but it does open the door to some additional funding. So whilst it does have a high level of complexity, and we really would recommend seeking appropriate legal advice if this is an interest to you, it does show that there are quite a few benefits to it because of that, opening up additional funding opportunities. The final model then is a registered charity, and to be a registered charity, you must be an organisation whose objects are wholly and exclusively charitable in law. So that does include the promotion of amateur football, or, for example, by providing facilities or community participation in sport. To become a registered charity, you can be either an unincorporated association or a company limited by guarantee. So either way, one of those is a legitimate pathway into registered charity status. On this one, your officers become trustees of the charity. And rather than being registered with Companies House, you become registered with the Charities Commission. Again, there's restrictions around social members because it has to be about the whole and exclusive promotion of amateur sports. But as I'm sure you can imagine, charitable status does open the door to quite a large number of additional funding opportunities, preferential rates and tax benefits, and so forth. That means there's going to be a large amount of regulation behind it, but again, large number of benefits. One thing to note with this is that if you do go down the route of being a registered charity, you cannot then reverse that status and go back to being a business or go back to being unincorporated. So, having looked at those four or five now different models of legal status, you might be wondering at what point do you look to change your legal status. First up is I'm going to caveat it once again that each club must determine its own best legal structure based on its own circumstances. I cannot tell you what structure to adopt or when. It is for the club as an organisation to determine that. But there are potential triggers which I would suggest if one of these is happening, you should be reviewing your legal status and making sure it is appropriate for your activities. And those are if you are acquiring land, and as we've mentioned before, unincorporated associations cannot own land, has to be an organisation, or you run the risk that actually it is an individual within the club that owns the land and therefore has sole control over it. If you are employing staff, because of the liabilities that come with that, again, it's you. We would recommend looking at some kind of incorporation to ensure that it's not an individual that's responsible for that salary. Should something happen to the club, kind of tied in with both of those is if you're entering into a long-term contract, or if you are looking at or agreeing to a long-term development plan. If you're saying, right, we're at the start of a 5 or a 10-year journey where at the end of that we want to be here, it may well be the only way to get there is by incorporating or registering as a charity to open up the door to that additional funding, or to open up the ability to acquire land, have longer term investments, employ staff, and so forth. Any change in legal status must be approved by the club members at an AGM or an SGM because, as we said before, they are the voting members. It is their organisation that you are changing the status of, whether they are just simply an association of playing members or a group of friends that come together to form a club, or whether they are club members of a company registered by guarantee. I had a question in the chat whether cask means you cannot claim gift aid on membership. I believe that is correct. I believe you have to be a registered charity to get gift aid. So it doesn't include cask at this time. So that's the different types of structures available. Just going to touch now on a couple of bits of resources that the county and the FA have available to help you kind of navigate all of this. First is I mentioned at the beginning about 97% of our clubs being listed as unincorporated on whole game. Through the new club portal that the FA has launched, you'll see that under the My Club section, it asks you to declare your legal status. It's voluntary at the moment, but it will really help us understand the club landscape and bucks if you can ensure that that is accurately represented. The default will be unincorporated association. So if you have gone on and become a cask, if you have become a charity or you have incorporated, we would ask you to update the system so that actually we're able to help serve you better. The other great benefit with this tab is that it is on here that you can access the FA's guide to club structures, and that is where I've got the vast majority of the information this evening has come from that. It's a document that the FA has had for a while. It was revised in the last 6 months or so. So it's fully up to date and has been produced by the FA's legal partners, Muckle. So that will take you through all the different steps, a lot more detail around the pros and cons of the different types of structures, how you go from one to the other. And it also has some case studies from clubs nationally who you may want to reach out to just to talk about their experiences. And it should be said, actually, we have a local club that was included in there, Woodley United, who are incorporated by guarantee. And it talks about their story and how they got to be incorporated. The other resource that we've put together over the course of the last season is a bit of a self-assessment form. It takes you through 7 different categories of club governance and just asks you to score yourself out of, for each one, there's 3 definitions. And you just tick the box that's most closely describes your club. At the end of it, it will give you opportunities and for reflection on what is good, what is you might want to take a look at, and then what's of serious concern based on your own assessment. You're more than welcome to complete that and then come back to us, and we can then work through a bit of a governance development plan to help you get everything to the level you want it to be. So we'll cover things like club constitution, and the definitions will be we don't have a written constitution. We have a constitution, but it hasn't been reviewed in 3 years, and then we have a constitution which is reviewed annually. You can probably imagine which is red, amber, and green for those. So just takes you through things like that. Probably take about half an hour maybe to complete. Recommend it's completed by the club secretary or chair, someone that's got that top level knowledge of how the club operates. But as I said, we can then work with you to look at where you might want to adapt your current constitution or your current operating model to make sure that you are as strong as possible as an institution, as an organization. As I said before, being unincorporated is not a bad thing. Um, it is the standard model, but there is certainly within that certain things you can do to make sure you're as protected as you possibly can be. That covers it for the presentation this evening. Thank you very much for joining. More than happy to stick around if you have any questions. You're welcome to unmute and throw them at me or drop them in the chat, and we can discuss it a bit more. But I will stop recording now and just want to say thank you again for joining us, and I hope you found it useful.